We've talked now about the misconceptions around negotiation and why they're not true. I want to reinforce the point that negotiation is extremely high leverage and illustrate for you why it's so worthwhile. One of the most famous articles in negotiation for engineers was written by Patio 11 or Patrick McKenzie. I'll leave a link for his essay in the description. And he had a really amazing story that illustrates the power, and I'll share that with you here. Imagine you are walking along and someone comes to you and says, hey, if you stand on one foot and recite a few lines of poetry, I will give you $100,000. What would you do? And that's why I have a picture of a cat here. This cute cat is sitting on one foot and saying some poetry. And I would argue, and what Patrick argues, is that you would be screaming stupid to reject that offer. It'll take you half an hour to memorize those lines of poetry, and you stand on one foot, and you might feel silly doing it, sure, it might be a little bit uncomfortable, but the payoff is so huge, $100,000 for half an hour of work. That is how you should think about negotiating your compensation. It's a little bit uncomfortable, a couple hours of work, but the outcome could be life-changing for you. And the reason it's important to call this out is that it is a bit uncomfortable for you, but that change in compensation, it might be trivial for the company. They might not even think twice about it. And for you to have the courage to ask could be a huge, huge improvement to your life. It could help you make 5 or even 6 figures of additional income. In particular, there's one tactic I'm going to share later on in the course that I know provably has led to hundreds of thousands of dollars of cumulative compensation increase for several of the Taro members who I've talked to who've implemented that. And I'll share more about that. But really, the cons of negotiation are your 15 minutes or 30 minutes to send an email. You might feel a bit awkward or uncomfortable. And the pros are 5 or 6 figures of compensation. So most rational people would say, yeah, it's a no-brainer. Why would you not do that? This point about the company and their perception of negotiation is also quite interesting because I think employees, they say, okay, I get a $150,000 salary. Could I really justify asking for $15K more? It's a 10% increase in my salary. Could that possibly come true? And they're not understanding that the company is actually already paying a lot more than your salary to employ you, right? So the employer cost, the full cost of employment, what we call fully loaded cost, is about $250,000. Here in the US, your health insurance is tied to your employer, so the company is probably going to pay for that. Payroll tax, 401k match can get pretty substantial at big tech. Meals, and desk and building. So for example, at Meta and Pinterest, which offered breakfast, lunch, and dinner, they told me that the cost per employee per year for serving all those meals was north of $8,000 per employee, right? And that's not obviously going into your paycheck, but that's a nice perk, and the company's already paying that cost no matter what. Same thing if you're working in a major metro area which has expensive real estate like New York or San Francisco, the company might easily be paying more than $10,000 or $15,000 to lease out or rent out that desk that you're going to go work at. And so if you think about it from that perspective, asking for 5K, 10K, 30K more is not as big of a jump as you might think it is, given that the company has all of these fixed costs associated with you. Here's one more very concrete reason why negotiation is so worthwhile. When you come into a company and you have a starting salary, there will be an increment on that salary every year. Your salary might go up on average 4 or 5% every year. Hopefully it's going to be inflation. Now let's assume that you negotiated really well and you got a higher package. That same percent increase means a lot more if you're doing it on a higher base salary. And so you might have negotiated a 20K increase in your salary, but 4 or 5 years down the road, that might have turned into a $40,000 increase, a delta in compensation relative to where you would have been. So you can see that starts to become quite meaningful very quickly. The other thing is that this will anchor you for any future jobs you might have. So by showing that the market is valuing you at a certain amount, you don't really go down from there. So in your next job or in your next assessment, you can use that as a benchmark for how much you should be getting compensated. So that anchoring effect is another really powerful reason that you want to make sure you negotiate. And I talk about negotiating being high leverage. The best example I could think of, and maybe the outcome that has translated to the most raw amount of money or wealth being created, is Steve Ballmer, who I think is an expert negotiator, whether intentionally or not, I'm not sure. But the story here is this is Steve Ballmer. Today, he is worth $120 billion. And that's billion with a B, not million. So he is, I think, in the 10 richest people in the world, or at least the top 50 richest people in the world. So he got his wealth from Microsoft. And what's interesting about Steve Ballmer is that he was employee number 30, and he joined Microsoft in 1980, 4 years after Microsoft was founded. And you would not think that an employee number 30 could ever become that wealthy. But here's how it happened. He negotiated a profit share at the time of him joining. And then in the multiple years after 1980, Microsoft, as you all know, is a generational company. Its revenues multiplied and multiplied and multiplied again and again. And so very quickly, that profit share became out of hand. Like Steve Ballmer would have made tens of millions of dollars in profit share because of how he negotiated. And so instead of a profit share, Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer and Paul Allen, they all came to the table and negotiated that instead of a profit share, he would get equity in the company. And of course, if you have a $2 or $3 trillion company like Microsoft is today, that equity turns out to be worth way more than any kind of profit share. And that's how Steve Ballmer ended up being worth $120 billion. One thing, this is a picture of Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer in 1980. And I love the fact that Steve Ballmer looks pretty much the same, 40 years later as he does in this picture. But that 8% equity that Steve Ballmer negotiated is the key to how he built up so much wealth. So I'm not promising you that you're going to become a billionaire by negotiating, but I do think the principles that Steve Ballmer applied and that I'm hoping to teach you here, those can be life-changing. So in the next section, we'll start talking about the core principles behind negotiating.